Hey guys, welcome to Z World News, all things strange and weird, bringing you suppressed content from around the world, so please enjoy. Hello Z Gang, we're back with another exciting suppressed history episode. Today's article came out in the Nexus magazine, volume 12, number 5, back in 2005, titled Britain's Secret War in Antarctica by James Robert. Okay, so this should be an exciting article. A quick summary: it's about the British military fighting Nazis in Antarctica and being attacked by a Bigfoot-like creature and UFOs. As told by a last surviving Special Air Service officer that was involved in it. Okay, now the Special Air Service, SAS, is a special forces unit of the British Army. The SAS was founded in 1941 as a regiment and later reconstituted as a corps in 1950. The unit undertakes a number of roles including covert reconnaissance, counterterrorism, direct action, and hostage rescue. So that's a little bit of background on the Special Air Service role. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the story. In 1938, Nazi Germany sent an expedition to Antarctica with a mission to investigate sites for a possible base and to make formal claims in the name of the Third Reich. To prepare them for their mission, they invited the great polar explorer Richard E. Byrd to lecture them on what to expect. The following year, a month after hostilities had commenced in Europe, the Germans returned to New Schwaben to finish what had been started, with many suggesting that a base was being constructed. 9 years later, Richard E. Byrd, who by now had become an admiral in the United States Navy, was sent to Antarctica with the largest task force ever assembled for a polar mission. In Admiral Byrd's own words, the mission, codenamed High Jump, was primarily of a military nature. Now, many claim that the task force was sent to eradicate a secret Nazi base in Queen's Maud Land, which the Nazis had renamed New Schwabenland, and which had never been explored as profoundly as the rest of the Antarctica. But as the fact that Admiral Byrd spoke of flying objects that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds, and with well-documented German activity before, during, and in the immediate aftermath of World War II, one can't help but wonder whether there is some truth in the Nazi Antarctica myth. Even so, could Operation High Jump and Byrd's quotes have overshadowed the truth about British excursions in the Antarctica by way of misinformation, bringing attention to his mission, and by doing so making sure that history only remembers one mysterious Antarctic mission? Okay, so when the Antarctica mystery is mentioned, Britain is never given more than a footnote. That fact is surprising in itself, especially as British forces were active in Antarctica throughout the war and possibly took the initiative in dealing with the Antarctic Nazi threat a whole 12 months before Operation High Jump was initiated. Now, Britain's activities on Antarctica, though less documented and more clandestine, are just as intriguing as a supposed much vaunted Operation High Jump. Unfortunately for Britain, those victories in the war, it was bankrupt and humiliated by the two new superpowers, i.e. US, Russia, but Britain was in a position to regain some pride and surreptitiously upset its supposed allies with the final decisive battle against the surviving Nazis. A battle that would never be recorded in the history books. A battle that would make its claim on the continent more legitimate, but most importantly, a battle that ended the war that had been compelled to wage. With the passing of time, all of those who served in the New Schwaben campaign are no longer with us. The last survivor gave me the following account of the forgotten battle. I hasten to add that the story was told on 2 separate occasions, 10 years apart, and there was not one discrepancy in either account. So, this is the account of the SAS officer's story. The New Schwaben campaign. When victory in Europe was announced, my unit was resting in a cave in the former Yugoslavia. I was thankful that the war had finally ended, though with war still being waged in the Pacific and tensions rising in Palestine, we were warned that our war could continue. Thankfully, I was spared from participating in the war against Japan, but alas, I was posted to Palestine, where the influx of Jews allied with the rise in Zionist terrorism was causing anguish not only to the inhabitants of Palestine, but also to the British forces that were sent to stem the Jewish influx and quell the uprisings. I was warned that my posting in Palestine would continue indefinitely. I saw many of my fellow soldiers die. Thankfully, I received an order at the beginning of October 1945 to report to my commanding officer, as I had been selected for a mission so secret that none of my senior officers knew why I had been requested to go to Gibraltar. I was not told why I had to report, but I went, hopefully that I would soon be discharged into Civvy Street. How wrong I was. I would be spending another Christmas on a war footing. Once I arrived on the Gibraltar, I was secreted away by a major and informed that I would be sent to the Falkland Islands dependencies for further briefing, and that I would be joined by several other soldiers from other elite British forces. The mystery thickened as we were all flown to the Falklands under complete silence. Now we were ordered to not even speculate about why we had been selected and where we were going. Upon reaching the desolate and foreboding Falkland Islands, we were introduced to the officer who was leading the expedition and a Norwegian who had served in the Norwegian resistance, an expert in winter warfare who was going to be training us for the mission that we had no inkling about. The Falklands is now considered the best kept secret in the British Army, and being posted there normally meant an easy few years. However, things were different in the 1940s, even more so for those who had been selected with me. We were forced to undertake a grueling month's training where we were prepared for cold weather warfare, from being plunged into the icy Atlantic to facing the elements in a tent on South Georgia. The training was arduous, and there seemed little sense in the madness that we were forced to undertake. However, after the month's training, we were briefed by a major and a scientist, and as the mission was relayed to us, we all realized that there would be little chance of us all returning, especially if the suspicions proved correct. We were informed that we were to investigate anomalous activities around the Muling-Hoffman Mountains from the British base in Modheim. Antarctica, so we were told, was Britain's secret war. We were then briefed on British activities in the South Pole during the war. We sat intrigued as to what was being divulged. None of us had heard anything so fascinating or frightening. It was not common knowledge that the Nazis had been to Antarctica in 1938 and 39, and even less known was the fact that the Britain began to set up a secret base on Antarctica around Antarctica in response. The one we were to visit, Modheim, was the biggest and most important, as well as the most clandestine Antarctica base of them all. Now, the reason for its importance was the fact that it was within 200 miles of where the Nazis had supposedly built their Antarctica base. We sat there stunned, but still the mystery deepened. We were told about German activity in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. We were also informed that an inestimable number of U-boats were missing and unaccounted for, but worse, some of those that had surrendered months after the war had ended fueled even more speculation. British forces had captured 3 of the biggest names in the Nazi party Hess, Himmler, and Donitz. And with their captures, Britain was given information that was not going to be shared with Russia or the United States. That information compelled Britain to act alone, and we were spearheading that operation. We were told in no specific terms what was expected of us and what Britain expected us to find on Antarctica. Britain had more than a strong suspicion that the Germans had built a secret base and had spirited many of the unaccounted Nazis away from the turmoil in Europe. Still, more and more revelations were forthcoming. The summer before, we were told the original scientists and commandos had found an ancient tunnel. Under orders, the force went through the tunnel, but only 2 returned before the Antarctic winter set in. During the winter months, the 2 survivors made absurd claims over the radio about polar men, ancient tunnels, and Nazis. Radio contact was finally lost in July 1945, and ominously for our mission going into the unknown, the last broadcast brought us all further anxiety as we listened to the fear in the voice. "The polar men have found us," was screamed before contact was lost. After the radio broadcast was played, we were then given a rousing speech from the major who would be leading the expedition to investigate what had happened. We are to go to the base at Mautheim, find the tunnel, investigate the enigma of the polar men and the Nazis, and do what we can to make sure the Nazi threat is destroyed. When asked for questions, we all had so many, thankfully the answers were honest and direct. We were informed that evasive action was being taken because Britain was well aware of US and USSR intentions in mounting their own expeditions, and Britain did not want to risk the chance that the US or the USSR would discover the base and gain further Nazi technology. Both countries had a technological advantage over Britain because of the scientists, equipment, and research both countries had recovered. Nevertheless, Britain wanted to be the nation to destroy the menace because Britain viewed Antarctica as under the British Empire's jurisdiction. And if the Nazis were there, it was their duty and their desire to eradicate them first, and thus deny both the USA and the USSR the propaganda value of fighting the last battle of World War II. Now, we were flown to the predestined drop-off point, which was 20 miles from the Mautheim base. Snow tractors had already been dispatched and were awaiting our arrival. After parachuting into the icy wilderness, full of fear and trepidation, we reached the snow tractors, and from that moment on, we were on a war footing. We had to operate under the complete radio silence. We were alone, with no backup and no chance of retreat if our worst fears were confirmed. We approached the base, weary of what was awaiting us, but when we got there, the base appeared devoid of life, a ghost town. Instantly, our suspicions were aroused, but just like all the previous campaigns I had fought during the war, we had a job to do, and so our personal fears could not shroud our judgment. As we split up to search the base, a tripwire was detonated and a siren sounded, destroying the silence and startling the whole force. A shout was soon heard, demanding us to identify ourselves, but the voice could not be targeted. With our guns raised, the major introduced us to the voice, and then thankfully the voice was given a body. The voice belonged to a lone survivor, and what he divulged made us more anxious and had us wishing that there were more troops among our ranks. The lone survivor claimed that in the bunker 1 was the other survivor from the tunnel trip, along with one of the mysterious polar men that we had heard on the recorded broadcast. Despite obstructions and objections from the survivor, bunker 1 was ordered to be opened. The survivor had to be held back, and his fear and anguish panicked us instantly, and none of us wanted to be the one to enter the bunker. Fortunately, I was not selected to enter. Then honor was bestowed on the youngest member of our unit. He proceeded inside, hesitating slightly as he struggled with the door. Now, once inside, a silence descended across the base, following moments later by 2 gunshots. The door was open and the polar man dashed to freedom. None of us was expecting what we saw. The polar man had fled into the surrounding terrain so quick that only a few token shots were fired. Out of fear and awe at what we had seen, we all decided to go into the bunker. Go in we did, and 2 bodies were found. The soldier who had pulled the short straw was found with his throat ripped out, and more heinous, the survivor had been stripped to the bones. What we had witnessed demanded answers, and with our abject anger at seeing one of our unit die within hours of our landing on the continent, our anger was taken out on the lone survivor who had warned us against opening Bunker 1. The whole unit listened categorically to the Major's questions, but it was the answers that were to provoke the most intrigue. The first question that needed answering was just what had happened to the other survivor and how he had become trapped in the bunker with the polar man. However, the lone survivor preferred to start from the beginning. From when they had first found the tunnel, while he narrated what had happened, the scientist who had accompanied us scribbled down everything divulged. It transpired that the area near the tunnel was one of Antarctica's unique dry valleys, and that was how they managed to find the tunnel with such ease. Each one of the 30 personnel at the Mordheim base was ordered to investigate and, if possible, find out exactly what the tunnel led. They followed the tunnel for miles, and eventually they came to a vast underground cavern that was abnormally warm. Some of the scientists believed that it was warmed geothermally. In the huge cavern were underground lakes. However, the mystery deepened as the cavern was lit artificially. The cavern proved so extensive that they had to split up, and that was when the real discoveries were made. The Nazis had constructed a huge base into the caverns and had even built docks for the U-boats, and one was identified supposedly. Still, the deeper they traveled, the more strange visions they were greeted with. The survivor reported that hangars for strange planes and excavations galore had been documented. However, their presence had not gone unnoticed. The 2 survivors at the Mordheim base witnessed their comrades get captured and executed one by one. After witnessing only 6 of the executions, they fled to the tunnel lest they be caught, with the aim to block up the tunnel. Though it was too late, the polar men were coming, claimed the survivor. With enemy forces hot on their tail, they had no choice but to try to get back to the base so that they could inform and warn their superiors about what they had uncovered. They managed to get back to the base, but with winter approaching and little chance of rescue, they believed it was their duty to make sure the secret Nazi base was reported, and so they split up, each taking a wireless and waiting in separate bunkers. One of the survivors tempted one of the polar men into the bunker in the hope that they'd believe only one had survived. The plan worked, but to the detriment of his life and to the radio. Unfortunately, the brave soul in Bunker 1 had the only fully operational wireless radio, which was destroyed in the fracas. The other survivor had no option but to sit and wait and try to avoid going stir-crazy. The mystery of who or what the polar men were was explained, not satisfactorily, but explained nonetheless, as a product of Nazi science, and the enigma of how the Nazis were getting power was also explained, albeit not in scientific terms. The power that the Nazis were utilizing was by volcanic activity, which gave them heat for steam, and also helped produce electricity. But the Nazis had also mastered an unknown energy source because the survivor claimed, "After what I witnessed, the amount of electricity needed is more than could be produced, in my opinion, by steam." The scientists amongst the party dismissed most of what was divulged and rebuked the survivor for his lack of scientific education and implied that his revelation could not possibly be true. Though the scientists dismissed the survivor's claims, the major didn't. He wanted to know more about the enemy that we were facing, but more fundamentally, just what the polar man was going to do next. The answer from the survivor did nothing to comfort us and provoked the scientists to announce that the survivor was certifiable. Disconcerted is too weak a word to describe how we felt when the survivor replied to the major's questions about the escaped polar man's intentions. He will wait, watch, and wonder just how different we taste. On hearing that, the major issued the battle cry, and guard duty was set up whilst the major and the scientists discussed in private just what we were to do next, even though it was obvious to the rest of us. The next morning, we were ordered to investigate the tunnel, and for the next 48 hours, we made our way steadily to the dry valley and the supposed ancient tunnel. Upon arriving in the dry valley, we were all amazed, for we had been told that Antarctica was completely icebound, and yet here we were in a valley that reminded me of being back in the North African Sahara. We were forbidden from even approaching the tunnel until the temporary base camp had been erected, and whilst the men constructed the base, the scientists and major investigated the tunnel. After a few hours, they returned to the new complete camp to chronicle what they had seen and what our next plan of action was to be. The tunnel was not an ancient passageway at all, claimed the scientist, although the major added that the walls were made of smooth granite and looked infinite. We were informed that we would be able to make our own minds up after we had rested for the night. Sleeping in Antarctica during the summer months was difficult, with perpetual daylight covering the continent, but that night sleep was even more difficult to come by, with all the thoughts running through each of our minds about what we would find and just when or where we would encounter the polar man again. Just before we were assigned our times for guard duty, we were informed that we would be following the tunnel all the way, to the Fuhrer if needs be. That night our fears were confirmed, as the polar man did indeed return. However, this time no more casualties occurred on our side, but the polar man was slain as he was lured to the camp. The scientists decided that the polar man was human, but it seemed had been able to produce more hair and withstand the cold far more effectively. The corpse, after a brief post-mortem, was stored in a body bag, and with the cold could be preserved until a more meticulous dissection could occur. The next morning it was decided that the two would remain at the tunnel's entrance with the corpse, the tractors, the equipment, but more fundamentally the radio. The major leading the expedition needed the Norwegian for his expertise and also the scientist. The survivor too was critical for the mission's success. The rest of us wanted to join them. I was selected with the other jubilant four who would be undertaking one of the most exciting and possibly one of the most important expeditions in human history. The two were kept behind, were disappointed, but their roles were just as vital to the mission's success as the 9 would be traversing into the unknown. As the 9 of us prepared to enter the tunnel, we made sure that we took enough ammunition and explosives to wage a small war and hopefully destroy the base in its entirety, for that was our mission, not to salvage but to destroy. We walked into the darkness, and thankfully, after 4 hours of walking, we began to see some light in the far distance. However, the light was still another hour away, and as each of us battled with our minds questions of what we would uncover, we inched forward. Eventually, we reached the vast cavern that was artificially lit. We were then led to where the survivors had witnessed the executions. The survivors stated it was as covert as one could possibly have wished for. As we looked over the entire cavern network, we were overwhelmed by the number of personnel scurrying about like ants. But what was impressive was the huge constructions that were being built. From what we were witnessing, the Nazis, it appeared, had been on Antarctica a long time. The scientist jotted down everything he could, drew diagrams, and took rock samples as well as the odd photograph. The major, on the other hand, was more interested in how the base was to be destroyed without being caught by the Nazis present. After 2 days of vigilant reconnaissance, the scientist and major decided on the targets for the mines. The mines were to be placed all around the roof of the cavern, with other targets on the to-do list, such as a generator and the petrol dumps, and if possible and attainable, the ammunition dumps. Throughout the day, mines were laid and more photos were taken, and with the odds of not being detected looking good, a hostage was taken, as well as proof of the Nazi base, the Polar Man, and photographs of new and quite advanced Nazi technology. When the mission to place the mines that would destroy the base had been accomplished, as well as substantial proof of the base gathered, we headed towards the tunnel, but also we were spotted, and more of the Polar Men and a troop of Nazis gave chase. Upon reaching the tunnel, we needed to put an obstacle in the way to slow down our enemy long enough for the mines to detonate. Some mines were placed at the entrance to the tunnel, and when the explosions were heard, we were hopeful that not just the base had been comprehensively destroyed, but so too the enemy forces giving chase. Now, we were wrong. The mines did indeed close the tunnel, but for those Nazis and Polar Men behind, the chase was still on. In a fighting retreat, only 3 of the 10 escaped the tunnel: the Norwegian, the scientist, and myself. The rest had fallen gallantly in making sure that some of the party survived. Upon reaching the safety of the dry valley, enough mines were laid to close the tunnel permanently. After the mines were detonated, there was no evidence of any tunnel ever existing. Suspiciously, very little of the evidence unearthed remained, whether it had been lost accidentally or purposely. It mattered little because the scientist had already made his and ultimately the mission's own conclusions. The camp was disbanded and we returned to the Modheim base, where we were evacuated and flown back to the safety of the Falkland Islands dependencies. Upon reaching South Georgia, we were issued with a directive that we were forbidden to reveal what we had seen, heard, or even encountered. The tunnel was explained away as nothing more than a freak of nature. Glacial erosion was the scientist's specific term. The Polar Men were nothing more than unkempt soldiers that had gone crazy. The fact that they were German was never submitted into the report, and any notion of the mission going public was firmly rebutted. The mission would never be made official, though certain elements of the mission were to be leaked to the Russians and the Americans. So my last Christmas of World War II was spent on the Antarctic continent in 1945, fighting the same Nazis that I had fought against every Christmas since 1940. What was worse was the fact that the expedition was never given any recognition, nor the survivors any credit. Instead, the British survivors were demobbed from the forces, while the scientist and his report would soon disappear. The mission never to be known about except by the select few. That mission never made the history books. But the return mission in February 1950, conducted by the joint British, Swedish, Norwegian expedition that lasted till January 1952, did. The main purpose of the expedition was to verify and investigate some of the findings of 1938 and 39 Nazi expeditions to New Schwaben. 5 years after our mission, Modheim and New Schwaben were revisited, and that expedition had everything to do with the New Schwaben campaign, but more importantly with what we had destroyed. For the intermediate years between the mission, the Royal Air Force continuously flew flights over New Schwaben. The RAF's official reason for their extensive flights was that they were searching for suitable places to set up base camps. However, one can't help but wonder. And that's the end of the SAS officer's account. Okay, so that was Britain's Secret War in Antarctica by James Robert. And just give you a little background of the author. James Robert is a civil servant with an agency of the UK Ministry of Defence, as well as a World War II historian and writer. He has traveled extensively throughout North Africa and Europe to investigate mysteries of the Britain's secret wars. With a family from a military background and with German sources giving many so-called myths credence, he has set a personal mission to delve deeper into the strange, suppressed, little-known, and anomalous activities that were conducted before, during, and after the war against Germany. Britain's Secret War in Antarctica has been taken from his forthcoming book that will document some of his investigations. So that's James Robert. Can be contacted at james-robert@hotmail.co.uk. So that gives you a little background of this author. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the reading today. If you have any comments about this article, go ahead and leave it on the bottom. And I'll see you on the next episode.